Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is rather unusual because most of the time our guests are policymakers. Liu Chiang Songchang is the director of the Oscar-nominated short documentary film Island in Between, Kinmen. For those of you who haven't seen it, go to New York Times website and you find it online. It's about 20 minutes, very easy to watch. But more importantly, today, we want to hear directly from Liu, the story behind making Kinmen, and what he hopes to accomplish through the storytelling of this island. So welcome, Liu.
Thank you, Wenqi. Very happy to be here.
So how did this film come about?
I have been working with CNEX, which is a foundation and production company here in Taipei. They have been hosting an annual pitching forum for documentary filmmakers in the Chinese diaspora, Taiwan, China, and other Chinese folks around the world. And I have been their basically mentor for those forums for a while for the producers that come to pitch the project. But in 2020, the CEO of CNEX, Ben Chiang, also decided that he would like to research a slate of projects, basically nonfiction projects like a series, feature-length documentary, short-form documentary, to tell Taiwanese stories for the international audience. And so I came on board to develop these ideas with them. And I happened to have visited Kinmen in 2020 as well, because during that time in Taipei, it was very difficult to travel internationally, and everybody basically took domestic trips. And my father had actually served in Kinmen as for his mandatory military service. So I was kind of mesmerized by Kinmen. I think like most Taiwanese people, we've all heard about Kinmen, but very few of us actually been there. So after going there and then realizing also Ben had just gone there, the two of us decided that this was going to be a really interesting project to pursue. And I wanted to come on board as the director.
So you visited Kinmen. Was it because it was during COVID and, kind of an interesting place to visit? What was the reason?
Yeah, that was really pretty much it. I have been fascinated by Kinmen for a long time, and sort of never really felt like the right opportunity to go there. I think like most Taiwanese folks, when you have the opportunity, what you do is you go abroad, right? But sort of luckily, in some ways, because of the restrictions, it made Kinmen such an appealing choice to go and check it out. So the first trip really was a purely travel as a visitor.
Yeah.
Tourist. Yeah, exactly.
Did you go with your parents?
I did when I went with my parents, and some of the shots that you see in the film with my parents were actually just home video shots that I took on that first trip.
I thought they actually went with you for the filmmaking. So it was actually from the very first trip.
Yeah. I mean, the film is for me, it's interesting in a way because it's really a combination of the material that I capture with a full crew, a professional crew, but also with a bunch of home video images, both from recent past, but also from when I was much younger.
Yeah. I want to sort of talk a little bit about that, right? Even though the movie is called Kinmen, Island in Between, anyone can tell it's really about you telling a story about yourself, who's kind of caught in between, right? You were born in Taiwan. When did you move to the US?
I moved to the U.S. when I was 15 years old. So I was actually a parachute kid. I think, folks who are familiar with Taiwanese society would know what that phenomenon was, which is that my parents stayed behind in Taiwan, and me and my younger siblings traveled to the U.S. and stayed there to study by ourselves.
Right. And then so most of your adulthood was in the U.S. And not until recently that you moved back to Taiwan. Is that right?
Yeah, I moved back to Taiwan about 7 years ago in 2017. But, because I have built my career as a documentarian in the West, I continue to travel back and forth, and I continue to take projects in the US and elsewhere. So I, in some ways, the silver lining for the pandemic is that I actually committed to stay here for a really long stretch of time. It was the longest stretch of time since I was a child. So really, I began to, in some ways, develop new relationship with Taiwan and have new interest about Taiwanese stories. And also because, the world has become more interested in Taiwan,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to seize this opportunity to share my perspective, and which I think, because I am in this position of understanding the Taiwan culture and society, but also really understanding the US culture and society, that I feel like I was the right person to translate this story for the international audience.
I think it's actually more than that. There was a part of the film that was really interesting, right? You had the Taibaozheng, you had the Taiwanese passport, and then you have an American passport. And you said it yourself, right? And I look at some of your past films, some of them were about China as well. So, you actually are one of these people who've been able to straddle between China, Taiwan, and the US, and have real experience in all three different places. That's why sort of making this film, Kinmen, was so interesting, because you are obviously caught in between. But can you let's drill deeper into this. What does that mean, caught in between? Um, yeah,
Yeah,
I want to hear from you. Yeah.
yeah. Just a quick clarification: the film's English name is actually Island in Between. The film's Chinese name
Right,
is
right,
Jim.
right.
Yeah, so if you search, for the film in English, it's just Island in Between. I feel like my identity as a Taiwanese and as an American and as a Taiwanese American is one that continues to evolve.
Mm,
Um, I think, for my generation, when I first arrived in the US, I really thought of myself and introduced myself as a Chinese American, because I think we all did. That's how we were taught. I think the Taiwanese identity, unlike, some other folks maybe in the US, my Taiwanese identity emerged later, or in become a much clearer shape later. But that also meant that when I started, being able to visit China, and was like a lot of people all over the world, and definitely in Taiwan as well, were fascinated by China. That added more complexity to my understanding of this very complex, tricky relationship that you were just describing between Taiwan and US and China. I think that in many ways, this film is about this, geopolitical situation across the Taiwan Strait that the rest of the world seems to be very fascinated about. But because of my particular background, I wanted to explore this from an extremely personal perspective, from my own perspective, from my family's perspective. And even though, my parents are Taiwanese, meaning that we're ethnic Chinese who's been in Taiwan for 7, 8 generations,
mhm.
I do maybe have a particularly complicated relationship with China, because I did spend, quite a bit of time there. I never lived there, but I've done many, many projects there as a filmmaker. I've taught there. My actually last independent feature length documentary was made in Shanghai. And then, I also really felt like the world, right, and especially, in the US, people confound the Chinese government with the Chinese people. And
Mhm.
so this really simplistic understanding of what being in China means, as well as being in Taiwan, right? People often think of the Taiwanese folks, in sort of almost like from a victim narrative, right? These are the unfortunate people who are, trapped and stuck. And so it's really, this film is just trying to kind of examine this and really present a more complicated situation when people are commonly are accustomed to.
And so through this process, what is your own conclusion, if there's any, or your own narrative of this complexity of, this Taiwanese identity, which I think more recently there's been more coverage in international media, especially because of, the past elections. But I think for a lot of people, even in the US who've been paying a lot of attention to China-Taiwan issues, that still seems like a relatively new thing for them to hear, which is somewhat of a surprise, I think, to a lot of Taiwanese people, probably.
Yeah, I think what Taiwanese people probably don't really understand is how complicated it is to explain Taiwan to the rest of the world. I mean,
Hmm.
we all grew up in the situation. We know the history, we know the difference between, Republic of China versus People of Republic of China versus what the world known as Taiwan, but the rest of the world, even just mentioning these names, a lot of them are just really confused.
Hmm.
Uh, so I think in terms of the evolution of my own understanding of myself, my own understanding of the situation. I don't necessarily think there's a conclusion. I think what I'm proposing is that it's a ever evolving situation, and my identity is an ever evolving identity. I wanted to look at this closely at this moment, but things might change. If the relationship improves, maybe my feelings towards the situation would be different. I mean, I can't really predict the future. I think that I hope for, and I think most of Taiwanese people hope for, is that there will be peace, and that Taiwanese people will have the power of this determination somehow, that we can actually have a say in our own future. So whatever shape that takes, I think that, I would personally support it.
I think it's a really good point that the identity may be evolving. So it's not the end, right? Because I think a lot of people feel that this may be it, but it sounds like it's a fluid identity. Now, I want to point out two lines in the film that really left a strong impression on me when describing this US-Taiwan-China relations. Quote unquote, a child involved in a three-way battle, hostile, codependent, manipulative. And then, quote unquote, they all think they know what's best for me, but they don't really care about what I want. I assume the I is Taiwan in this case, right?
I think I would say that I is Taiwanese people.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like these parental figure that I'm referring to are the powers that be, the government, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you look at the way that I wrote the narration, if you will, the way I speak in the film, it's really about personalizing a very complicated geopolitical situation, try to make it relatable, in terms and phrases that I think people across different culture and, across different region can understand. And I do, I think as a person feel torn, feel like, they are different parties that are involved in my life as a Taiwanese person, and that I don't necessarily have any say in it. Obviously, as a Taiwanese person, we can have more influence over our own government's decisions and whatnot. But the way that, historically U.S. has related to Taiwan, and definitely the way that Taiwan has related to China, I think using the term dysfunctional isn't necessarily an accurate way of describing it. And also so much confusing sort of performative way of acting out these relationships, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like for the US part, there's only one China, but these are two different nations, for Taiwan and China, it's like, well, Taiwan would like to have the Chinese economy, as a market, but, we're not willing to, follow whatever the Chinese government wants. And for Chinese government, demanding that Taiwan be legally considered part of the territories, and also making these proposals that they obviously cannot follow through on, as evidence in the relationship that they've had with China, with Hong Kong, for instance. So, again, like layers upon layers, a very complicated
Mm-hmm.
relationship. And I think that I did choose to describe it as, like three-way custody battle between three parental figure. I hope it's appropriate. I think that it maybe achieves the effect. Maybe it is a way to simplify this really complicated relationship. But that is kind of the goal. I think that I wanted to be able to simplify the situation enough for those who maybe have not had much exposure to the situation, across the Taiwan Strait, to gain some, understanding, to have a glimpse of what it might be like, what it might feel like. Feeling and emotion is being the key in this situation.
And do you feel that Taiwanese people know what they want?
I don't know if I should be speaking for the whole entire Taiwanese people, right? Um, I think anecdotally, I don't know anybody who does not want peace. I don't know anybody who wanted, sort of stronger confrontation. I think people want here where people want everywhere else, which is to have, some stability, security, some a safe environment to build a family, to have some certainty in our future, right? And whatever that means, in terms of the policies. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I don't know most Taiwanese can translate what they want as an individual into what can be done,
Mhm.
from the government's perspective.
And and what do you want, right? There's a reason why you're making this film, and I feel like the film is a statement about the way it is right now, which is not ideal. Clearly, you can tell from the film. And so, what is your statement, I guess? What do you want the world to learn from this film?
Um, I guess, for me, there are two answers, right? I think that there's the reason why I made the film. What do I want people to get out of the film? Which really is just, I wanted to stimulate some curiosity
Mhm.
from the audiences outside of the region. So they will actually, want to learn more about Taiwan, that this is a glimpse of the situation, to complement all the journalistic coverage out there about the Taiwanese situation, some of which might be a little bit more heightened than the locals would like. But I think that this will kind of, give them a little bit of a look into what it might be like to be a Taiwanese person at this moment. In terms of what I want, for the society, for the country. I just really feel like this is about the right for self-determination. That what I want is for the Taiwanese to be able to uh, have what they want as a collective group of people. If the Taiwan have an election and it votes for something tomorrow, I want that something to happen instead of
Mhm.
having it being, tempered or adjusted because we're too afraid of offending somebody, or that there will be consequences that is outside our control. So I want Taiwanese people to be able to set their own goals and build their own futures.
Well, I think there's so many facets of this film, even though it's not even 20 minutes. And there are two women, in your film, and they're from China. I find it quite fascinating. I actually would have loved to hear more about their stories. Can you just kind of share with our audience why you also profiled them? They're from mainland China, right? In this film, and what did you hope to sort of convey through them?
Well, I think that what I attempt to do was to visit, a few different representatives from a few different group of people who live in Kinmen, right? And as some folks would know, that Kinmen is probably one of the first places to have marriage partners from China. After the relationship normalized, in the early 2000s or even earlier, actually. And the reason why I profile them, because in my mind, even though, you know, they were not born and raised in Taiwan, they have married into a Taiwanese family. They have Taiwanese children. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I don't know if they see themselves as Taiwanese or not, but for me, I see them as part of, the very diverse society of Taiwan, and I
And there
want
are
to feel.
actually a lot of them, right? I mean, for
I
those who
yeah,
don't
I mean,
understand.
I don't
Yeah.
know how many, but I think it's significant. And I actually
Hmm.
have another scene that I shot that I wasn't able to use, which was they had all a bunch of them had all gotten together for lunch. Maybe like a group of 12 people. And I think some of them have been in Jinmen for 15, 20 years, right? I
Hmm.
mean, they've raised the whole family there. And I think they're stuck in between in ways that I'm not sure I fully understand, and I really wanted to give them a voice, and also again, offer up another perspective, one that's probably, unfamiliar to most people outside of Taiwan. Even for folks in Taiwan, I don't think people necessarily um, take time and have had conversations with folks like them, about their perspective of what's happening. So I was personally very interested as well, and I'm glad that I was able to capture that, fairly simple, but I think it's quite meaningful and insightful interaction that they had.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you feel like, that people living in Jinmen actually see themselves anything different from people living in the main Taiwan island?
Again, I think this is from my personal observation. It's, by no means meant to speak for the Jimen people or represent Jimen people. But I do think there is sort of on average, right? Predominant attitude, if you will, have a different perspective in Jimen than from the main Taiwan island. I mean, just the fact that they have relatives and they're so close, that the physical distance, the fact that it was one sort of lived environment before this war, this sort of man-made thing separates it from each other, from Xiamen,
Mhm.
specifically. So they're going to have very different feelings towards the people on the other side. They have experience, like maybe some of them have invested property in Xiamen. Definitely, they were beneficiaries of the income that was brought in by the tour groups, from
Mhm.
mainland. Probably, definitely, obviously in Taiwan main island as well. But I think in Jinmen it's more acute because people do come there in huge flocks, and it's not a big place, so it's very prominent. So yeah, I mean, I think their perspective about China and their perspective about their relationship to Taiwan as well,
Mhm.
the government in Taipei is quite different, I think, from on average from most people on the main Taiwan island.
Yeah, just given sort of the connectivity between, let's just say, Jimen and Xiamen, right? If you anyone who's visited both places would feel like they're so similar, the food, the culture, the people, etc. So the very conversation about a possibility of war, um, is it unfathomable to them, or is that something that's on their mind, thinking actually it is very likely? What is, tell our audience, how do people really see that possibility of a war?
I mean, I think it has a range of reaction like you would get also, in rest of Taiwan, right? I think there are people who says there's no way that that's ever going to happen. It's, the international media being in hysteria over the situation. And sometimes it does feel like that folks from the outside, they're seeking, conflict in order to heighten, make the coverage more interesting, make the stories more interesting. But at the same time, I've definitely heard people say things like, well, if you look at history, this is how China works, that um, oftentimes the territory expands and contracts and expands and contracts. And so, maybe it's time. I mean, somebody did say this, that it's not unforeseeable that that Kinmen or even the rest of Taiwan will be reabsorbed, for lack of better verb, into China. So I think that the attitude ranges. There are folks who says, yeah, if there was a war, Kinmen will be fine because they would just go directly shoot a missile to Taiwan, right? I mean, war game scenario. I mean, I'm not, I
Yeah.
don't want to, make it sound like there's sort of a carelessness of the
Hmm.
Kinmen regarding Taiwan, because it's definitely not the case. People, for the most part, like at least in my interactions with them, really respect and love living in the system that we have here. But if you really push them, like I did ask some folks about, like, well, what do you think will happen? And one person says, what will happen is the main Taiwan island actually will be more dangerous than Kinmen. So maybe there will be people flocking to Kinmen to seek safety
Yeah.
from the attacks, because the mainland will be much kinder to Kinmen because it's a closer cultural,
Hmm.
a piece of territory than the rest of Taiwan, perhaps. These are
Yeah.
all speculations. And when I first heard that, it was actually kind of a shocking, confusing idea. But if I thought about it a little longer, I guess that's possible and logical that that would be the case. So again, very, very varied. And then, I think that again, these are all people making speculations, right? Nobody knows what's actually going to happen. Nobody's saying, I
Well,
know for sure it's going to happen tomorrow.
yeah, I'm sure even if you talk to, Xi Jinping, I'm not really sure if he's made up his mind either. However, especially from, 2 years ago, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and then the most recent elections, there's just so much international sort of attention and worry of the escalation of risk and even the possibility of a war. But on the contrary, and you were in Taiwan at that time, on the island, people don't seem to worry as much. And so, how do you explain that discrepancy? And it's not just about people in Taiwan. Actually, from what I know, and by talking to a lot of people who live in China, they are also less worried about the possibility of a war. And of course, the Chinese government has been saying, oh, Chinese would never kill Chinese, that's not possible. So how do you explain that, to the rest of the world, that there's such difference?
Well, I mean, I think the big problem here is that the Chinese government, the Xi administration is so opaque that there's no pattern to be able to analyze and come to some kind of educated guess as in, what the next actions will be. Nobody knows. And I can see why, people in Taiwan, my neighbors and, people I come in touch with during the day to think that it's not possible because we've grown up in this for the last, we lived in this for the last 70 years for several generations, constant possibility of something bad happening. And then maybe a couple of times even on the verge of something does happen, but it just never did happen.
Mhm.
And for folks who want to have a normal life, you have to have developed a healthy sense of, I mean, you could say that's a healthy sense of denial. Some might say that this is actually the logical, educated, attitude from living here and experiencing it for a long time, is that there just is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of hot air and nothing will actually happen. I don't know, right? Like, I don't know if these folks are right. I don't know if the all the pundits and scholars and people who study, who play out war games, they're thinking like the attack is imminent. It's going to happen in the next 2 years, the next 5 years. I don't know if they're right, and you're saying some folks in China says there's no way, but I've also had friends, who, from China and then people, the Chinese friends in diaspora who calls me and say, hey, you should think about getting some of your property out of Taiwan because it feels really scary right now, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the ultimate frustration, and
Yeah.
I think that maybe that's the feeling that I'm trying to capture is like what's it
Yes.
like to
Yep.
live in under this limbo,
Yep.
you know, and and in many ways, I'm actually really proud of Taiwanese people who, that how we be able to thrive and build this
Yeah.
really, like great civil society, like become this economic powerhouse, even under this constant shadow of something could or could not, terrible that may or may not happen.
Yeah.
But I no nobody knows.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. We have to end today's conversation, but this is only the beginning because I know you're about to start your campaign. The Oscar is on what, March 10th? Is
Much
that
then,
right?
yeah.
So there's still about a month to go, and there's a lot of work to be done. Of course, we're all fingers crossed for you, and hopefully we'll have you back to even talk more about not just this film, but others. But thank you so much for joining us, and more importantly, for highlighting this complexity of the issue from, I would say, Taiwan's point of view. So thank you, Leo.
Thank you, Wenchi.
Great.